Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., I would like to welcome you to this timely webinar dealing with the oil market, the economic impact of COVID-19 on the Arab world economies. We are pleased to organize this webinar in terms of our continuing coverage of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly in terms of our own focus, the Middle East, the Arab world in particular. We are honored to have with us today two experts whom I will introduce in a minute or two to help us decipher in practical terms how this global health crisis has affected the economies of the region, both in terms of short-term and also long-term, the implications of the oil price war on Gulf economies, particularly the developments of the past 48 hours with regards to the crash of oil prices in very historic and unprecedented manner, and the implications of that for the region and internationally for the markets. And the recent US mediated agreement with the so-called OPEC Plus, and discuss a little bit the future of OPEC in light of the details of that agreement, whether OPEC is still really necessary and in what shape it might survive. Our speakers today are Garbis Iradian, and he's the chief economist of Middle East for the Middle East and North Africa at the Institute for International Finance, the IIF, and where he is in charge of Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and the GCC, most of the countries we would like to discuss today. And prior to his affiliation with the IIF, Dr. Iradian served as senior economist and resident rep at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, here in DC. And he is a widely respected expert on economic growth, particularly in transitional economies around the region and the world. He is widely published on the topics of MENA economies, oil markets, OPEC production, and so on. Our next guest today is our friend Basma Momani, Assistant Vice President of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, our good neighbors to the north. And Basma is a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and serves on the board of directors of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. She has authored and edited many books and publications, articles on international politics, Middle East affairs, and the global economy. Each one of our speakers would speak for 12 to 15 minutes. Then we will engage in a short conversation for a couple of minutes, just to initiate our Q&A session, and then we will give you the opportunity, our audience online, to ask your questions. Let me, by way of announcement, just say that be brief in your questions, preferably a question rather than a comment. Address it to a specific speaker, if you don't mind. Indicate your name and your affiliation. And if you are using Zoom platform to join us today, use the Q&A feature of the portal at the bottom of the page. And if you are connected through the ACW website, use our email. Send your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. Events@arabcenterdc, one word, .org. With that, let's go ahead and proceed with the program. The questions that we have raised with the speakers, as I said earlier, deal with first of all, the nature of the crisis itself. So feel free to share with us your understanding or your assessment of the global context of the pandemic, and then narrow down that to the Arab world specifically. And then we'll go into a question and answer session. Dr. Iradian, please.
Thank you, Khalil. Let me first start with the oil market, because this is crucial for most of the countries in the region. This is, for the region as a whole, this is a twin shock. First, the global recession. Most countries around the world will contract this year, ranging from -3 to -6. In Europe, for example, -6 or so. In the United States, around -4. So it's a big shock, unprecedented. It hasn't been like that since the Second World War. So the main thing on the oil market is the demand shock. In 2015 and 2016, it was mainly supply shock. However, now it's dominated by the demand shock, where global recession, deep recession, led to sharp decline in demand for oil. Just in the past 2 months, global demand for oil plunged by about 25%. Now, OPEC Plus Alliance, which is led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, they met 1 week ago, and on April 12th, they agreed to cut crude oil production by 9.7 million barrels a day. To put it in perspective, this is about 10% of global supply. However, this agreement will be effective in May of this year. So still you have excess supply in the market, and we've seen it in oil prices dropping more than 60-70%. And yesterday, the WTI, which is the benchmark for United States, went to negative territory. It was a glitch because there is enough supply of oil in United States, and storage capacity reached its limits. So oil companies are trying to give it free. However, today I checked the future market. It shows that WTI is hovering around $15 per barrel, and Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, is slightly over $20 per barrel. I expect that oil prices for the second quarter of this year to bottom around $30, and then in the second half of this year, it could pick up depending on partial recovery of the global economy. It all depends on COVID-19. There is much uncertainty how long it will last, and that will affect the global demand for oil. But overall, beyond the short term, future prices show that prices of oil will remain low. Future prices now showing that oil averaging about $40 per barrel for Brent for this year, and recovering gradually to around $50 by 2024. So imagine that the Middle East oil exporters are living in an era of prolonged low oil prices, and this poses major challenges. Let me say a few words on the MENA oil exporters, which includes the 6 GCC countries, Algeria, and Iraq. So we said Arab world, so Iran is not included here. Now, there is variation among these countries how they will cope with the plunge in oil prices. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait could cope with low oil prices for at least 2-3 years. The reason is that public debt to GDP ratio is modest. For example, in Saudi Arabia is around 25% last year. It could rise to 35% this year. And they have large financial buffers in the form of official reserve and sovereign wealth funds. For example, Kuwait sovereign wealth fund is about 5 times the size of the economy. So there is enough cushion, and they can easily finance the large fiscal and current account deficits. Incidentally, in the past few weeks, Qatar raised about 10 billion in the international market, and followed by Abu Dhabi also raised about 7-8 billion. Saudi Arabia also is raising. So there is no constraint on financing the deficit in the short term for the 4 GCC oil exporters. The major risk is with Algeria, Iraq, Oman, and Bahrain. Oman and Bahrain's debt to GDP is quite high, and they don't have enough official reserves or sovereign wealth fund. This is why Oman and Bahrain decided to cut government spending, because they don't have choice. They will face difficulty financing the large deficits. Even Algeria also, they cut current spending by 30%. So imagine in an environment of weak economic activity or contraction, you're cutting fiscal spending. In the past several decades, most of the growth in MENA oil exporters came from large public spending. So the private sector didn't play a major role. It's mainly public spending. It has reversed since 2015, and now you are in a situation of prolonged low oil prices. They cannot increase public spending, and it will take some time for the private sector to be the main sector for growth. And that needs diversification, and experiences from many oil exporters around the world shows that this is a long process. In a way, low oil prices could be more incentive for oil exporters in the region to reform. So I'm expecting that MENA oil exporters' real GDP to contract by about 4%. As I said here, there is variation. Algeria could contract 6%, Iraq by 7%. And part of the contraction, the high contraction, is due to the cut in crude oil production. In GDP, you have oil GDP and non-oil GDP. So if you cut production of oil, it will affect your overall growth. And although there has been stimulus packages, it's mainly in the form of providing liquidity to the banking system to lend to SMEs at concessional terms. This could help a little bit. However, government spending has been reduced in most of these countries. Fortunately, monetary policy is easing. They cut interest rates by 100 basis points. In Egypt, which is a net oil importer, policy rates was reduced by 300 basis points. So overall, the MENA oil exporters, their aggregated current account balance will shift from a surplus of around 100 billion in 2019 to something around 120 billion deficit. So imagine the scale. This is a shock of 220 billion for oil exporters in the region. The fiscal deficit will widen also from around 3% of GDP on aggregate in 2019 to more than 10% this year. Again, I said some countries in the region will be able to easily finance these deficits. Others are facing depletion of their official reserves, including Iraq, Algeria, Bahrain, and to some extent Oman. Oman has a small sovereign wealth fund which could be tapped. There is much uncertainty beyond the short term, and that would depend on the evolution of oil prices. So I expect that even after the crisis is over and the global economy recovers slightly, you will still have oil prices ranging between $40 to $50, because whenever oil prices goes more than $50, you will see shale production in the United States increasing. So there will be supply shock. Currently, non-OPEC producers outside the OPEC Plus Alliance are expected also to reduce their production by about 40 million barrels a day, mainly in Canada, United States, Brazil, and Norway. This could help in the second half of this year. So let me say a few words on the MENA oil importers, which includes Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon, and Sudan. Of course, these countries could benefit a little bit from lower oil prices because the import bill of oil will be much lower. However, a slowdown in the or contraction in the global economy, and particularly in the Middle East, will impact negatively on the MENA oil importers in the form of less tourism income, less remittances from the GCC, less investment. So I would say also Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan will record a contraction in the economy between -2 to -4. Lebanon had its own problem before this crisis, where the economy could contract by about 15%. Egypt, which was the best performer among the MENA countries in the past 3 years, growth was around 5%. They accumulated enough official reserves because there has been a major adjustment in the economy in the form of floating exchange rate, unification of the parallel and the official rate, due to the IMF program, which started towards end of 2016, is in a better situation to cope with the current crisis. They might register a small growth for this year, and that's mainly because 2020 is the fiscal year which starts from July 2019 and ends in June 2020. So the first half of the year was a growth rate of 5%, and the second half could be contraction about 2 or 3%. So nonetheless, Egypt is facing challenges. Foreign holdings of domestic treasury bills were sold in the amount of 10 billion, and Egypt might face difficulty financing its large current account and fiscal deficit, although they have enough official reserves. So I wouldn't exclude the possibility beyond the short term that Egypt approaches IMF for another program. Recently, Morocco started tapping the precautionary fund arrangement. Tunisia and Jordan, they already have an IMF program. They are tapping also the emergency fund from the IMF. So overall, I think in the short term they can cope well. However, most of these countries, with the exception of Egypt, they already experienced weak growth, around 1% for the past 3-4 years, including Jordan, Tunisia, and to some extent Morocco. So unemployment rate is very high. In Jordan is around 18%, in Tunisia 16%. In Egypt, it came down from high level, now it's about 10%. So there are major challenges for these countries. Even if we mention from among oil exporters, in Saudi Arabia, national unemployment rate was 12% last year. So unemployment rate could increase this year to around 13% or more if the economy contracts, the non-oil economy contracts by about 4%. So that's a major challenge for Saudi Arabia. UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, they have a smaller national population. They can easily take care of them given their large sovereign wealth fund. So I'll stop here and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive presentation. A lot of facts there to deal with, and I'm sure it will generate a lot of questions over some of these issues that you explained rather well, but I'm sure that there will be some inquiries from our audience. Dr. Momani, tfaddali, your turn.
Islam Khalil. So thank you to the Arab Center for including me in this conversation. I'm probably even more pessimistic than my colleague, which is saying a lot because, as you heard, a very pessimistic sort of scenario forecasting of where we're going. I think I'm going to start sort of globally and then kind of zoom into the region. The big challenge I think we have also is global liquidity is not where it should be. And I think the IMF has been very confident, I think actually very optimistic in its forecasting, and the numbers that you heard from my colleague very much follow the IMF's assessment. I think it's actually much worse. We have never been in a situation where half of the IMF membership, which is in fact what is happening today, 90 countries have approached the IMF, and we're just at the beginning of this. And frankly, I think the big unknown is that, frankly, the coronavirus has not hit the developing world yet. It has been, isolated in Asia, it's in the West, but wait till it hits countries with massive populations, no state capacity, no public health infrastructure. So I'm extremely pessimistic. And if there's anything that we know about this virus, its veracity is quite strong. So the challenge here is there's a shortage of global liquidity. I think it'll continue to be that way. Obviously, oil prices and entire commodity prices, it's not just oil, pretty much every commodity. So whether you're an exporter of potash to any mineral, we're all basically seeing a absolute decline of commodity prices. Now, added to that, one of the big engines of economic growth globally is China. China is what gobbles up most of that oil in terms of global demand. And it is simply not going to be in the positive for a very long time. Certainly, I think this has been said many a times before, we can't trust Chinese data. But I think some of the, global economists who are looking at everything from electricity usage to the visuals of sort of nighttime satellites in terms of lights going on and production, it's at a standstill. And I don't think that is going to change because the demand for Chinese production is in the West and the West is not consuming. So there's a trickle down effect here in terms of how negative this is for everybody. But that is a big challenge. Of course, many of the Middle East countries had previously depended on whether it's multilateral organizations like the IMF or even official development assistance, the West, primarily Europe, the United States to a lesser extent, and all the official development assistance that used to come from the West is not just going to be dried up, but frankly, there's no appetite in much of the West to really give the Middle East any sort of financial resources. So you have this enormous shortage of capital that I think we're going to see eventually come down to hit all of these countries. And as my colleague said earlier, these are countries that don't have a lot of fiscal space. Now, a lot of the oil exporting Gulf countries do, but I'll go into some of the challenges I think they're going to face here as well. So some countries do have reserves, and that is an important defense against potential shocks, but those are also slowly going to dry up, and much of the forecasts of their budgets have been based on assumptions of $75 a barrel, which we know is not going to happen. I'm not optimistic about the June futures, because once we get to June, I think we might see again more of that negative selling that we saw, which was basically, please come take it off our hands and we'll give you money, which is where we're, I think, going to be even in June, because this is not going to pick up. The global economy is not going to pick up in a month's time. This all points to another problem, which is about economic scarring, which is how much of this economic pain is semi-permanent. This is something that I think is so undeniably new to all of us. We're all dealing with this big question mark, but that is the real essence of the issue. Do we think that this is just a temporary fix that once the global economy starts refiring its engine, is it just about rebooting? I don't think so. I think we're going to see enormous restructuring in every sector. We're seeing it already, looking at small businesses that are going to collapse. So we're going to see mergers of oil companies. We're going to see mergers of, every sector, retail, service, it's all going to be affected. So the ripple effects of that is not good on anybody. So, I mean, that's the big picture that I think keeps me worried at night. Now, as far as the Middle East and including the Gulf, of course, the decrease in oil prices, where many countries are dependent on oil exports, in the Gulf in particular, is going to be problematic if we continue at some of these rates. Now, if we see, and it's all about frankly, what the international sale price of oil is. You know, in a country like Iraq, the cost of production is in some places as low as $5 a barrel. In parts of Saudi Arabia, it's maybe 10 to 15. If you get to a point where we continue to see not just negative, but those low numbers continue, it'll be frankly not worth taking out of the ground. That means you don't have revenue. Now, of course, there is a bit of an inertia in the market. It's not that it's going straight to consumer overnight, but you can just see the fallout ripple throughout the markets for a very long time. The other thing, of course, is some countries are slightly diversified, and some of the Gulf countries have tried to lean on tourism, airline. All of that is at a standstill. There's going to be no big sporting events. Again, the Gulf countries, some of them have been thinking about attracting big sporting events as a way to generate revenue. All of that is going to be dried up. People are canceling events well into the fall. So that's going to be a problem. And also back to the cultural and psychological aspect, how many people feel comfortable getting on a plane in the next year without a vaccine? So we're looking at a very long-term situation. And by long-term, I mean a year to 2 years. That is not a short-term fix. The other thing I think we have to think about is, of course, we're all understanding how workers' remittances feature into the balance sheet of every country in the Middle East. No country is affected. I mean, just to give you a stat that keeps me up at night, 1.5 million Egyptians are in Saudi Arabia. Those are the most vulnerable of vulnerables who are now basically without wage. Many of them are indeed day laborers, and that's another challenge. We have, with all due respect to the statistics that come out of the region, they often undercount the informal economy. They don't count in who is it that is dependent on day wages. Some estimates in Egypt are, 40 to 50% are day laborers. What does that mean? That means when this gets to a critical point, which we're going to get there probably in a month's time in places like Egypt, that means, are they going to go out to get food for the day, or are they going to stay inside in quarantine? I think we all know what the options are. You add to that the slums, the squalor of 10 people to a room, and those are the ripe conditions for the coronavirus to go maddening throughout a society. Intergenerational family structures where grandma lives at home. I mean, you just put the scenario building, and the West, we've been looking at devastation. I can say in Canada in particular, how old age homes have been devastated. Well, frankly, that's when most of these senior citizens are in isolated facilities. What happens when they're in your home? I mean, you just have to start to see how this ripples into the family structure in Middle East societies, and it's devastating. So I'm very pessimistic about how this is going to unravel socially, politically, and economically throughout the region. Now going to sort of the economic situation of many Middle East countries, they not only have, in many cases, most of them don't have enormous amount of reserves, some do, but they're also very low, shallow tax bases. So other than sort of VATs, value-added taxes, which is basically a sales tax, they don't really have a lot of, they don't depend on income tax. And so if there's no consumption, which we're at a standstill right now, no consumption, they're not getting a tax base. So their fiscal envelope is shrinking by the day. There's no social safety net. Public health infrastructure is poor, to say the least. It's certainly very inequitable in that the rich have access to public health care, and in some cases, very good public health care, but the masses do not. And so what's going to happen when you have, again, that ripe condition of this virus overtaking many of these countries? I'm extremely pessimistic, as you can see. Now, guest workers in the Gulf, we don't talk about them enough. This is, again, another segment of society where it's very ripe. They tend to have lower baseline health. They tend to be not healthy in the first place. Add to that, they're trapped in no man's land in the sense that they're not working. They're stuck in their quarters. There's been lots of Amnesty International and human rights reports on the conditions that they live in. Many people to one room once the virus hits those places. Now, they are in many cases in the Gulf countries. Those guest workers that are in the construction industry and other places are going to be, again, right conditions for this virus to have an outbreak. So that's going to be very difficult for Gulf countries to manage. Added to that, unfortunately, there is systemic racism and discrimination to those communities. And so are they going to be quick to respond, or are they going to securitize the problem, which is most likely the case in many places? So that's also another challenge going on. In terms of the one thing that only keeps me somewhat optimistic in the Middle East is it has a young population. So maybe in some cases, the death rate may not be as bad, but it's that intergenerational family structure that I think we have to keep in mind. Other sectors that I would keep an eye on, and I put on my senior administration hat here as a senior vice president at the university, is universities in the Gulf are also an important source of not just revenue, but an important sector of the society and an economy. They are going to be hit very badly. Now, they are mostly subsidized by Gulf countries, but increasingly all of us are faced with the huge challenge that our university campuses may be empty. Those are also places where ripe conditions for spread. That is not good for the Gulf countries that have spent more than a decade trying to attract all of these universities to set up shop. It's going to be very problematic, I think, coming forward. Of course, places like UAE ports, it certainly depends on the entire port infrastructure in places like the UAE, to a lesser extent some of the other countries, are all going to see an enormous standstill, similarly because it is about moving goods and services, mostly goods I should say, between Asia, China, and other parts of the Middle East. That's going to be come to a standstill. Big signature events, the Qatar World Cup. I was there recently, very sad to see. Those things may not happen. The UAE's World Fair may not happen. What is that going to do? That is a very sad situation, but it is unfortunately a realistic one if we think about it. Now, the other point here, and I'm going to wrap up, is that, of course, for many of these countries, these oil exporting countries, they're pegged to the US dollar. So they can't print money, and they're very much held hostage by the US Federal Reserve. And we know how that is very much politicized, or trying to be politicized, by the Trump administration. And there's going to be, I think, challenges and conversations, maybe one good thing out of it, about, what do we do about the long-term health of oil being, such a core part of the Gulf economies, when it is basically being held hostage to the monetary policy of the United States. Big question. I remember working on that 10 years ago. I think it's going to come back as a conversation. There's lots of people talking about post-oil. Is this a time to move away from oil? I love my environmentalist friends who keep thinking this is going to be great for renewables. I don't think so, because we know that renewables and other unconventional sources of energy tend to do really well when oil prices are high. So that's not good news for moving away from oil, but it does mean that I think countries are going to have interesting conversations yet again about diversification, and that is going to be an important part of thinking about a post-COVID recovery for much of these countries. One thing I would look for is, are we going to see a renationalization? I mean, the Saudiization of the labor force, all of these kinds of things we saw from the last global financial crisis were really born out of that pressure on governments to, get rid of expat labor, think about increasing the quotas of nationals in the workforce. Will we have conversations like that again? I think that's going to happen. We haven't seen some of you might remember this. I would certainly remember being in Dubai when all of the cars of expats that were being leased were left in the airport, and literally people left. Are we going to start to see that happen? I mean, we need to prepare for those kinds of scenarios, because it will get that bad. In terms of a stimulus, yes, some countries have been pouring money at this, and as my colleague pointed out, Qatar, countries like Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi have been able to do that. Yes, Bahrain, Oman, and others are going to be more vulnerable, but I think this is a time to be as pessimistic as one can get, because I think it's far worse than any global recession. I think we're just being optimistic by not saying the word depression, but that's kind of where I think we're going. And I haven't even touched on the political aspect But I'll leave that there because that will really depress you. And I think we want to try and keep this conversation a little light.
Thank you, Basma, for your brutal assessment. Brutal, but yet very realistic and straightforward in terms of the difficulties that the region, the Arab region, is facing. Let me engage both of you in just a couple quick questions, and I would appreciate quick answers from you so we can open the floor for the Q&A session with our audience. First, going to Dr. Iradian. I got the impression from your presentation that you tend to agree generally with the assessment of the IMF that this crisis is like no other, with severe uncertainty about both duration and intensity, as you made it very clear in your presentation. But let me ask you to say a few more words about, I mean, you did give us some good meaty assessment with regards to the intensity. How about the duration? What's your assessment? I know you did touch on that one, but how do you see the duration of this crisis?
Yeah, duration of the crisis when it comes to the Middle East could be different than the global economy. So even if the global economy recovers, assuming it recovers somewhat in the second half of the year, of this year, the duration of the crisis for the Middle East could be long time, because I can't see oil prices recovering to significantly over $50. So as long as we are in an era of prolonged low oil prices, something below $50, the region will face major challenges, particularly oil exporters in the region. Now, the duration, it all depends on the evolution of COVID-19, whether there will be vaccine soon in 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years. I heard yesterday that it could come more aggressively next winter. So for the Middle East is double shock, low oil prices, and also the COVID-19, which is leading to a deep recession globally. So I don't see in the short term a light at the end of the tunnel for some of the Middle Eastern countries. Challenges are there. Even before this crisis, most countries in the region were suffering from low growth, high unemployment, increase in poverty, particularly in oil importers in the region. And to some extent, Saudi Arabia, where 30 million population, foreigners are 10 million, and national unemployment is very high. So that's a major challenge.
Let me follow up on a statement that I saw recently made by Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD, in which he said it was wishful thinking, quote unquote, to believe that these countries would bounce back quickly. Yes or no? Do you agree with it?
Of course, I agree with him. They will not. Which countries? You mean Middle Eastern countries or
Arab countries in general?
Oh no, I mean, they could recover from what? From a low base. So it's a partial recovery. I don't think the recovery will be strong. I mean, the fundamentals, if you take in Morocco, are strong relatively. Egypt made major progress in reforming its economy. So Egypt also stands in a better situation than others. However, Jordan, Tunisia, Lebanon, Sudan, it would be very difficult.
Okay. Basma, in a way, you spend a lot of time career-wise looking at the IMF. You wrote the book on the organization, so to speak. After hearing this, with the possibility, as Garbi mentioned, 5.9% economic contraction in the US this year, 7.5% as some experts have said in most EU countries, even 5.2% in Japan. What can the IMF do in light of what you mentioned, that already 90 countries out of 189 have asked for help? I know the IMF has a large capacity in terms of lending, but can it meet the lending requirements of this massive demand right now?
No, not if everybody comes at the same time. That's, you know, a classic challenge of everybody trying to really, you know, tap into IMF financing all at once. And the other thing too I would point out is that the IMF could not get an agreement of its core members, and by that I mean the creditor countries, to increase its liquidity. The Trump administration does not want to put money into the IMF. So there's going to be an enormous amount of resentment or let's say, hesitation amongst donor countries to put their money into the fund. That's a big challenge. And at the end of the day, it's like a credit union. It depends on people putting money in. Governments don't want to put their money in. So that's going to be a challenge. Of course, there's a bigger debate about increasing the reserves of the IMF that's being held up, not just by the Trump administration, but also Congress for a number of political reasons I won't have to go into. But at the end of the day, the Americans have to agree to even let other countries put more money into the IMF. So it's really, we're at a standstill because international cooperation, thanks to the Trump administration, is also at its, you know, it's at its lowest. That's going to be a big challenge. Now, you could say maybe some money might come from, I mean, the Chinese are trying to use public diplomacy at its all-time high in the sense of putting money into, whether it's the Asian Development Bank, maybe put more money into the AIIB. All of that is, you know, well and good, but, you know, the Chinese also tend not to give direct loans. They want to build projects. And this is not about building projects. I mean, that might be a stimulus package later down the road, but for many Middle East countries, it's literally going to be a fiscal squeeze, and that they're going to have no income, or low income, and very high expenses with the public health nightmare that is coming before them. I think, you know, the way this virus works is it flourishes in a very dense environment. It flourishes in intergenerational homes. And that is exactly, you know, the situation we have in many Middle East urban areas. It is not going to be good when it hits the Middle East, when it hits the guest worker, you know, rooms and boarding type situation. And one other thing I want to point out in terms of a sector that I'm very interested in that I think is going to suffer, and there's been a lot of investment of time and energy on this, which is the entrepreneurial sector, the small and medium-sized enterprises. You know, this is where we're going to see the first sense of collapse. So I'm not worried about the big, you know, Middle East companies, the corporate giants, if you will. But think about all of the investment that's been made in the past decade, trying to get SMEs, particularly for young people, entrepreneurs. Wow, this is devastating for any entrepreneur. Small businesses are going to be the first ones to feel this. And I think that is a really sad indictment on, you know, the development trajectory for the region. You know, if you were, you know, this debate, you know, many of us political economists have been on this debate about motivating the private sector and getting people off the public sector. But if anything, this crisis has taught us that, you know, it's really nice to have a public sector cushion. And some of us who have, you know, jobs in big public sector industries are the ones that are doing okay. It's the ones that are really in the private sector, SMEs, that are going to suffer the most because they don't have the same cushion. And so that's a really sad, you know, almost we're going to see a rewinding of some of the reforms that have been done throughout the region as a result.
Excellent. We're beginning to get some questions from our audience. So let me invite you both to put your political hats on, because it looks from the questions we have received, at least the first couple, tend to have a political flavor to them more than what our discussion has been thus far. The first question is, or set of questions actually, came from Kivanj Oskan, and who's asking, do you agree with the, that's addressed to both in a way, do you agree with the prediction that a kind of political and military tension in the Middle East would find regional support if it helps, or because it might help to increase oil prices?
Yeah, I can answer this question.
Sure.
I think it's highly unlikely that tensions in the Middle East will escalate in the form, let's say, if Iran attacks some of the oil ships in Strait of Hormuz, where more than 30% of the global oil flows. Iran doesn't. Iran's exports of oil is very small due to the U.S. sanctions. So it's mainly a few 100,000 barrels a day to China. I don't think that is plausible at this stage. Most likely Iran will wait another 6 months till the next U.S. presidential elections with the hope that Democrats will win and the whole picture changes about U.S. sanctions. Now, if that happens, if there is an attack by Iran on some of the ships, of course you will see oil prices increasing, but that will be very short term, because the dominant factor of the oil prices now is the collapse in global demand. So supply shock, a small supply shock will not alter the picture.
Basma, you have written over the past year or two about the economic situation in Lebanon, Iraq. There's the unrest in both countries. So the next question comes from Minatullah Al-Ubaidi. How do you think this crisis will influence social unrest in the near future, particularly in these countries that he mentioned, Lebanon and Iraq?
So I'm very pessimistic about this because, you know, we know there's a tendency in the Middle East to securitize these kinds of problems. And actually, I shouldn't even say it's the Middle East. I mean, I think there's going to be a global appetite to use the security sector to manage this crisis. And what I mean by that is it is not inconceivable. And we've already seen in countries like Jordan, the military, I think for good, has been used to patrol people, to pretty much make sure people don't go out into the street. But the question here, and this is a broader challenge that I think all societies are going to face, is how much power will we give to whether it's police, military, national guards, to basically enforce everything from lockdowns to be a part of the recovery. I could see already signs of, frankly, in Egypt, from anybody who's been watching, the military encroaching on, you know, its civilian space. Wait till the military starts in Egypt being basically public health administrators, because that's going to be coming. And so that sort of securitization of this is going to happen, I think, across the board. The one challenge I would point out here is that also this is comes at a time when there is enormous public distrust in government. And it doesn't help if the information that's coming out from government is mixed, if the information coming out from government is propaganda. We know, and there's lots of research on this, Amirta Sen and others, who look at these places where information is tightly controlled and censored, that this lack of trust really creates a ripe environment for conspiracy theories, a ripe environment for basically undermining public health efforts. You know, surveillance increases in all of these countries, particularly the Gulf countries. They already have the mechanisms for surveillance. They're already watching all of their citizens. There's going to be an enormous securitization of this space moving forward, whereby we're going to be expecting, you know, our phones to be a part of contract tracing for containing the virus. And you can't roll that back. Once governments have access to that kind of technology, it's very difficult to get governments to give it back again. So it's not just, I mean, really, even in liberal democracies, I think we're going to face this question. It's a broader problem. But in the Middle East, where there is already a very strong security sector, strong, you know, internal intelligence, suspicion, vis-a-vis the government and the public, I think we're going to see more of this kind of surveillance, particularly through technology, which becomes a problem politically. Now, I know we pointed to the first question was about Iraq and Lebanon, but I really wanted to lay that out because this is kind of the environment and the questions as a political scientist that I'm very interested in that's going to be moving forward. And the Middle East has not done well generally in terms of building trust between it and the citizens. The Arab Spring was all about a breakdown of trust. It doesn't do well in terms of allowing the free flow of information, which makes all of these fake news and you know, conspiracy theories, and therefore a disservice to public health efforts, that much more widespread. In the case of Iraq and Lebanon, they're already suffering from an economic crisis. They're already suffering from a lack of trust in central authority. And of course, you can't forget that there is, of course, foreign intervention in all of these countries, whereby everybody is trying to, jostle for power. So it's not healthy, is the short of it, even though I haven't responded to the precise question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Parviz, go ahead.
Yes, if I may add a few points on the likely social unrest in Lebanon and Iraq. It's, I would say, in a way, the lockdown and the restrictions on the movement help the local authorities in the sense you don't see any demonstrations. But once this is gradually lifted, you will see mass protests, particularly in Lebanon, because nothing has changed. They didn't reform. Corruption is still very high. There are certain laws to fight corruption and restore the stolen money, which has to be discussed in the parliament and approved. It hasn't been done. Lebanese economy is contracting more than 15% this year. Poverty is more than 40%. Unemployment more than 25%. So most likely after a few months, if the restrictions on movement is lifted, you will see massive protests. Same thing with Iraq. Iraq is in the same situation. In fact, Lebanon and Iraq and Iran are the most highly corrupt countries in the world, according to the classification by World Bank and other institutions. So it's most likely there will be massive protests, even in Algeria.
Thank you. Let me ask you, if you don't mind, Garbis, to shift gear a little bit to something you alluded to in your opening remarks, which is the OPEC situation and particularly the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. This question came to us saying, did the Saudis misjudge oil demand when they started the oil price war? Is this indicative of the current decision-making process there?
Definitely.
Who won this, if you will?
You know what happened in Saudi Arabia, as it happened many times, this impulsive behavior by Mohammed bin Salman. He has advisors that they don't say what they think, they say things that he would like to hear. So they misassessed the situation. That there will be a huge plunge in global demand for oil, and let's try to increase crude oil production by Saudi Arabia so that we drive shale producers in the United States out of business, and we increase the share of Saudi supply in global supply. However, this came as a surprise with the plunge in global demand for oil, and all countries are suffering. So they didn't have choice but to agree with the Russians. In fact, Russia also realized the mistakes they have done, that to mitigate the impact on oil prices, let's agree and cut crude oil production within the OPEC Plus alliance by about 10 million barrels a day. I mean, the situation would have been worse if there wasn't an agreement at the OPEC Plus level. You would see oil prices even in the second half around $20. Now it's likely that oil prices could recover slightly from around 20, 25 to something around 35 in the second half of this year.
The next question comes from Alain Kfouri. Will the GCC governments be able to borrow their way out of lower oil prices? And with their decreasing financial buffers, how do they see the changing geopolitics and geoeconomics of the Arab region, as the GCC could no longer, in a way, finance the region and meet the demand for aid? Basma, you want to take a jab at that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yes, it can. I think the Gulf still will have relatively good ratings, and so it will be able to go to the market, whether it's, it will go to the capital markets. It could also very much continue to think about issuing domestic bonds of some sort. So it has capacity. I'm not too worried about it financially, definitely not in the long term, and not so much in the short or medium term, but it's going to hurt. I mean, that's the point. The point is going to hurt, and some countries is going to hurt more than others. Still, oil exporting countries in the medium term are going to do relatively okay. But this is a crisis. And I think it's, it's the countries like Oman, it's the countries like Bahrain, certainly many of the oil importing countries throughout the Middle East that are going to really suffer financially from this. So yes, there's access to funding that they can get. And frankly, they have enough reserves and sovereign wealth funds, as my colleague pointed out. So they're going to be able to tap into that. They're not in a crisis situation, but managing this, getting out of it, is going to be very difficult.
All right, let me ask 2 or 3 questions with the remaining few minutes, and maybe give a chance to both of you to answer in like 1 minute short answers to some of these. Just take your pick, which question you're interested in. Some of them, they're addressed to both of you. One, with regards to the region's heavy involvement in arms sales. How is this crisis going to impact arms sales, particularly in the GCC? And the second question is with regard to China securing its oil supply from the region in light of the competition and the diminishing cuts and diminishing supply and so on. Are we going to see some more competition, including friction in a way, tension between the superpowers to secure their needs of regional oil at this particular time? And the third one would be with regards to the role of the sovereign wealth funds, which, Garbis, you referred to that in your remarks. Is the importance of the role of sovereign funds going to increase in this crisis, particularly in the potential attempts for recovery? So I'll leave you with that over the next 3 minutes. Take your pick and quick answers, please.
Yes. I can say a few things on the military expenditure in the region. I think in the current situation, given the limited fiscal space, most countries in the region, whether it's Oman, Saudi Arabia, they will reduce military spending. I wouldn't exclude the possibility of a peace between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. That could happen in the near future, and also tensions in the Middle East could be reduced. So military spending, of course, could decline, but however, from very high level. On the question of the sovereign wealth funds, there is enough sovereign wealth fund, which is, I said, more than 3 times the size of the respective economies. In Saudi Arabia, you have the public investment fund, and you have the official reserves about 500 billion. So that gives you around 800, 900 billion dollar. In Kuwait, you have 600 billion, 5 times the GDP. In Qatar, etc., and in the UAE. So for the time being, what will happen with the sovereign wealth fund? They will be used more domestically to finance the large deficit instead of investing it abroad. With the uncertainty in the global economy, I think they will draw some of their sovereign wealth fund and spending on domestic projects and finance the large deficit. So they can cope with such a situation for several years, but eventually, if oil prices stay very low, they have to think of depegging. Most of the GCC countries' currencies are pegged to the dollar. So beyond the short term, I wouldn't exclude the possibility of moving to a flexible exchange rate, which will help this country to better adjust to external shocks, as it happened in Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. They were able to adjust to lower oil prices by depreciating their currencies.
Thank you. Basma, the final word is yours.
So I'm going to be controversial. The question about arms sales is really about, do you believe that arms are for internal or external use? And so the reality is that if this is for internal use, and I think a lot of countries are thinking of their arms as internal use. And if you're fearful that this is a time when you're actually going to be targeted more, sometimes, I mean, think about Saudi Arabia, just to pick on it because it's easy, not because it's the only country. You know, think about the fact that they've seen the spread come from the eastern provinces. You know, they may see that that is a restive situation. They may need to deploy some of their internal equipment to basically preserve the peace. Certainly there's going to be a lot of effort to put some or to acquire technology in terms of surveillance, absolutely. But if it's about regime perseverance or preservation, frankly, I think we're going to see more, you know, arms sales go to the region, but for specific uses, which is to protect the palaces, to do street monitoring, to do the patrolling on the ground. So I don't think we're all out of the water in terms of it being in decline. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, this is really a validation of the need for sovereign wealth funds. It was really about preparing for a rainy day. Some of the wording, and I think it's Kuwait, about, you know, the future generations. The big debate is going to be, when is the time to use the sovereign wealth funds, as my colleague pointed out. Are they going to be saying now is the time to use the sovereign wealth funds and help this current generation? Or is there going to be debates in some of these countries that, you know, it's really for another 10 to 20 years down the road? I think it's going to be an important public debate in places like the Kuwaiti parliament, for example.
Thank you, Dr. Momini and Dr. Iradian, for joining us today. Appreciate your time and appreciate your straightforward answers. We leave this program not necessarily with higher morale, but definitely with more information to be able to understand what we're facing in this crisis. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And please, we look forward to seeing you again in future programs. Have a good day.